So let's now get started with adding our own logic, because as I said, NextAuth won't do everything for us here when we roll with our own authentication system, with our own user accounts. And therefore, before we use NextAuth for anything, we will first of all have to add the logic to create users. Because NextAuth can then help us with authenticating those users and with getting the token for those users, but to create the users themselves, we need to bring our own logic. Hence, I'll bring up my dev server again, and I want to add an API route which gets input, which gets a request with an email and a password, which in the end should be sent from the login page if we are creating a new account. And then that data should be used to store that user. And I will use MongoDB again as a database for storing the user data, but you can go with any database you want. It doesn't have to be MongoDB, but MongoDB, especially when using MongoDB Atlas, is just great to use, free to get started, easy to use with JavaScript, and already hosted for us. So that's great. Hence, we'll need to add an API route and therefore this API folder in the pages folder. And in that API folder, I'll then add an auth subfolder. And in that auth subfolder, a Signup.js file. Now the file name is up to you. And in there, I'll then define my handler function, which will be responsible for creating a new user. And we should, of course, as always, export that function thereafter. Now, in here, we want to connect to the database and store the incoming user data. Hence, I will actually quit the dev server one more time and then install the MongoDB package again, as we also did before in the course already, and then restart the dev server. Because we'll need that MongoDB package to successfully connect to that database and talk to that database. We will actually also talk to that database from multiple functions here, from multiple API routes later. And therefore, to share some logic, I'll add a new folder on my root level of the project, a lib folder. We could also name it helpers, whatever you want. And in there, I'll add my db.js file. File name, of course, is up to you. And it's that file which should help me with establishing a connection and so on. So here in this db.js file, I'll import from MongoDB. And as before in the course, I'll import Mongo client, because that's the thing that helps us establish a connection. And then I'll add a function, connect to database, could be the function name, and in there we'll do what the name implies. We'll use Mongo client to call the connect method, and then here pass our connection string with which we connect to a database. Now for MongoDB, we can get that string from MongoDB Atlas with a created cluster, and therefore you should make sure that you have that cluster. We did create that earlier in the course already, so make sure that you don't skip those previous parts where we talked to MongoDB already. And once you got a cluster created, you can click on connect on your cluster, connect your application, and then it's this connection string which we need and which we are interested in. So I'll use that connection string, and here we now need to replace some pieces of data, like the username, password, and the database here. Now for username and password, I will go to database access and make sure that I have a valid password for this user here. Create a new password and update it. And then use my username. You need at least one user with read and write access created in MongoDB Atlas. And then add the password here. And then for the database name, I'll name this auth-demo, but that database name is up to you. That's now the connection string. Now connect returns a promise, and to use async await, I'll add async in front of the function and then await this connection result here, or to be precise, the connected client, which we get back as a response. Now, this could be failing, but for the moment, let's ignore that. And let's then just return that client here, maybe. so that when someone calls connect to database, that someone gets this client. Now that function should be usable from outside this file, so we'll export it. And now back in the Signup.js API route, here I first of all want to call connect to database, and hence import this from that lib folder and the db file. Now I'll also turn this into an async function to use await here, and then here we get that connected client, and we can then get access to the concrete database by calling client.db like this. And now that we got access to the database, we want to create a new user and store it in some collection of that database. Because as you learned before in this course already, MongoDB works with collections of documents, where a single user would be a document and all the users would be stored together in a collection. We get access to a collection by calling the collection method onDB, and we can use any collection we want. If it doesn't exist yet, it will be created on the fly. So here we could maybe work with a users collection. Now to get the submitted user data, we should accept the request and response objects here in our API route function. You learned that API route functions give us access to the incoming request and then also to this response object to send back a response. And then we want to extract the incoming data. And actually, we maybe want to do that first, so that we only proceed as soon as we know that we have valid data. So here we then basically get our data by accessing request body. And then from there, we get our, let's say, email and password. And these key names are up to you. I will extract them from the incoming request body. We will just have to make sure that later when we submit this form, this auth form, that we actually do add email and password to the request which we send to this API route when we want to create a user. So there for now we got that. And now that we got email and password, we definitely also want to validate it. We want to check that we don't store invalid data. So if we don't have an email, or let's say if not email includes an @ symbol, or if we don't have a password, or if password trimmed for whitespace has a length that is, let's say, smaller than 7, so that we require at least 7 characters for security reasons. If any of these conditions is met, so if we have invalid data, then I want to return to not continue with function execution, and I'll send back a response with a 422 status code and some extra information, like a message where I say invalid input, password should also be at least 7 characters long. Something like this. That's the response we sent back if we got invalid input. If we make it past this if check though, we know that we have valid input, and then we want to store our user data in the database, so in that user's collection. Hence here we want to insert a new document. We can do this with insert1 as we saw before in the course. And we can create that document on the fly here and simply add the email field, which is that extracted email we got here, and then the password. However, regarding the password, there is something we have to keep in mind and take care of. We should not store the plain password like this in the database. Because if our database ever gets compromised by some employee or a third-party intruder, then all our user credentials would be usable just like this. Hence, for security reasons, it is a best practice and strongly recommended that you don't store plain passwords in the database, but that you instead encrypt them such that they can't be decrypted. And we will still be able to verify them later, no worries, but we want to make sure that we store passwords in encrypted form. And to encrypt passwords, we can install another third-party package with npm install, and that's bcrypt auth.js, like this. That's a package which helps us encrypt passwords, or encrypt any kind of data, of course, but we'll use it for a password here. And hence I'll start my dev server again, and now I want to encrypt my password, and for this in the lib folder, I'll add another folder, auth.js, which will hold those authentication related utility methods. And here I want to import from bcrypt.js, from that package we just installed. And from there, I want to import the hash function. Then I want to export an async function called hash password and take the original plain text password as an input. And then in there, call hash on that password. And the second argument then should be a number of salting rounds, which in the end will influence how strong that password is. And here a value of 12 is considered to be safe. The higher the number, the longer this function will take. The lower the number, the more insecure it is. So 12 should be an okay value. And hash will then also return a promise, which eventually gives us that encrypted password. So we can await this to have our hashed password here in the end. And then it's this hashed password which I return, just like this. Now back in Signup.js, we therefore now want to create such a hashed password and store that in our collection instead of the plain password. So here I get the hashed password by calling hash password and importing that function from the lib folder and the auth file there. And then to hash password, we pass our plain text password. And then it's this hashed password which we store in the document, so in the collection overall. Now insert1 also returns a promise, so we can await this, and this will return the result of this operation, which then, for example, gives us access to the automatically generated user ID. Now with that, we're storing a user in the database, and now I want to send back a response, therefore, a success response, where we say something like created user. Now I'll not implement error handling here, since I really want to focus on the core auth parts, and we saw error handling with MongoDB and so on in action before already, and hence I'll keep this lean and focused on the parts that are related to user creation in this case. And therefore now we should be able to test this. In the next lecture, let's make sure that we send a request to this signup API route.